The death penalty. The subject of capital punishment has been debated throughout history, both inside and outside the church. Scripture records its existence under the Old Covenant, yet it also reveals the unfolding purpose of God that reaches its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. To understand this subject properly, it is important to distinguish between God's covenant with Israel and the covenant established through Christ. The death penalty under the Old Covenant. The law of Moses contained numerous offenses that carried the death penalty: murder, adultery, blasphemy, idolatry, false prophecy, kidnapping, and certain acts of rebellion were punishable by death. These judgments were not given to all nations, but specifically to Israel as God's covenant nation. These laws demonstrated the holiness of God and the seriousness of sin. Israel functioned as both a religious community and a civil nation. Therefore, violations of God's covenant often carried civil penalties as well as spiritual consequences. The severity of these penalties emphasized that sin produces death. The law exposed humanity's inability to achieve righteousness through obedience. Rather than providing life through human performance, it revealed mankind's need for a greater solution. Christ fulfilled the law. Jesus declared that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Matthew 5, verse 17. Throughout his earthly ministry, he fulfilled everything the law, the prophets, and the Psalms anticipated. The penalties prescribed by the law ultimately pointed toward Christ himself. Although completely innocent, he bore the curse that belonged to sinners. His crucifixion satisfied the righteous demands of the law once for all. The cross demonstrated both God's justice and his mercy. Justice was not ignored, it was fulfilled. Mercy was not earned, it was freely given because Christ bore what the law demanded. The believer no longer stands under the covenant that administered blessings and curses according to obedience. Instead, believers stand in the finished work of Christ, whose sacrifice has forever accomplished what repeated judgments under the law could never achieve. The end of the Old Covenant order. The New Testament repeatedly describes a transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. The temple, priesthood, sacrifices, and covenantal administration all pointed toward Christ and reached their fulfillment in him. The judgment that Jesus foretold upon Jerusalem marked the close of the Old Covenant age. The destruction of the temple brought an end to the sacrificial system that had defined Israel's covenant life for centuries. The age governed by the Mosaic covenant came to its completion just as Jesus and his apostles had proclaimed. Because the covenant itself has reached its fulfillment, the civil legislation given exclusively to ancient Israel is not transferred to the church. The church is not a geopolitical nation with civil authority to enforce the judicial code of Moses. It is a spiritual body made up of people from every nation. Civil government. Scripture recognizes the existence of civil governments. Earthly rulers bear responsibility for maintaining order and administering justice within society. The authority of governments does not arise from the Mosaic covenant, but from God's providential ordering of human society. Different nations establish their own legal systems and penalties according to their constitutions and laws. The New Testament does not instruct the church to establish a civil code modeled after ancient Israel, nor does it commission believers to carry out judicial punishments as representatives of the kingdom of Christ. Instead, the church proclaims reconciliation, forgiveness, and the completed work of Christ, while governments fulfill their civic responsibilities. Justice and mercy. The Bible presents justice as good because God is just. At the same time, it reveals extraordinary mercy toward sinners. Jesus welcomed tax collectors, prostitutes, persecutors, and criminals who trusted him. His kingdom advances not through coercion, but through the proclamation of the gospel. Even those who have committed terrible crimes are not beyond the reach of God's grace. The cross declares that forgiveness is available because Christ has already borne sin's ultimate judgment. This does not erase earthly consequences for criminal actions, but it does reveal that no sinner is excluded from the invitation to believe the good news. The focus of the church. The central mission of the church is not to legislate civil penalties, but to announce what Christ has accomplished. The message is that sin has been dealt with through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Righteousness is received through faith, not through law-keeping. Believers live from acceptance rather than striving for acceptance. Whether discussing justice, punishment, or forgiveness, every subject ultimately points back to Christ. He fulfilled the law, satisfied divine justice, inaugurated the new covenant, and brought to completion everything necessary for the salvation of his people. The death penalty, therefore, is best understood within the covenantal framework of Scripture. It belonged to Israel's judicial system under the law, while the church proclaims the completed work of Christ under the new covenant. The believer's confidence rests not in the penalties of the former covenant, but in the finished work of the one who fulfilled it completely.